All right, good afternoon, 7 o'clock Tuesday evening. We're going to continue with the Parshat classes. Last week we finished the book of Numbers, the book of Bamidbar. This week we're beginning Deuteronomy, otherwise in Hebrew known as Devarim, meaning words. It is considered that this book is Moses talking. The first four books of the Bible are God speaking through Moses. Moses is the mouthpiece through which God speaks to the people, speaks to us. And this book, Deuteronomy, is known as the Mishnah Torah. It's known as the review of the Torah. It's Moses' speech, his last will and testimony, so to speak, before he dies. We're in the last year of the desert sojourn. The Jews are poised on the edge of the Jordan River, about to cross over and go into the land of Israel. And this is Moses before he dies. He's not going to make it into the land. It's been decreed, when we talked about that before, as to many different commentators' ideas as to why Moses doesn't go into the land. He doesn't get to go into the land. He gets to see the land. And he gets to take the Jewish people all the way up to the end. And we know he's going to die. And this is the last month before he dies. It's the rest of the book of Deuteronomy is Moses speaking to the people. He's going to recap where they've come from, where they're going, what they need to know. It's sort of like your last dying, on your dying bed. What do you say to the people around you? What do you want them to know? What do you want them to hold on to? What do you want them to internalize as the truth and the way to go, right? So when we look at the Torah and we see the Torah as a law book, as well as a collection of stories, we see it as a way, a guidebook to lead our life, a way for us to relate in this physical world, bringing God and spirituality into it. And I think when we speak about this particular time period, this Torah portion, Devarim, is always read right before the holiday, the day Tisha B'Av, the day of memory, the day that we cried. And in this week's Torah portion, Moses goes over the story that led to the 9th of Av, which is Tisha B'Av, which is going to fall out next Thursday, Wednesday night, Thursday. It's a 25-hour fast. It's a day of mourning the destruction of the temple, but it's also a mourning that began when the spies come back after Moses agrees to sending spies into the land 40 years ago. The Jewish people wanted to spy out the land. They wanted to see what it was going to be like. They wanted to know how to conquer it. The spies go in. There are 12 spies, and it's retold over to the people in this week's Torah portion, even though we learned about it in, so to speak, chronological order. We're going to repeat the story of the spies, but the story of the spies was a way in which these spies came back, the scouts came back with a report, and they spoke glowingly of the land. It's a beautiful land. It flows with milk and honey. It's an amazing land. It has people in it who are giants. And then they add their own twist to it, and they say it is a place that we can't conquer. We can't do this. We're scared. And almost they're so disturbed by the report. The people are so disturbed by this quote-unquote evil report that the spies bring back, 10 of the 12 spies, and they believe it, and they believe they can't go in, and they believe they can't conquer the land, and they cry. And that's the first night. That's Tisha B'Av. That's what we now have in our history as a night of mourning of many different catastrophes that have happened over Jewish history that happened on this night. The destruction of the two temples, the start of World War II, I believe the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. So many catastrophes have happened on this night. It's a night of crying, and I want to talk about crying a little bit well, maybe I'll talk about crying now. Let's talk about crying now. What is it that the Jewish people cried about in the Torah when the spies came back? They cried because they didn't think they could conquer the land. On some level, on deep fundamental level, they thought maybe God's not with them. Maybe God can't do this. Maybe God's abandoned us. And in that space between what can I do and what can God help me to do, there's anxiety, there's fear, and that fear led to them crying. many years later, obviously, we have the destruction of the temples, which happened on the 9th of Av. And we today, thousands of years later, we sit on the floor and we cry. We cry about the loss of the temple. And it sounds so obscure, and it sounds so like thousands of years ago the temple was destroyed. What are we crying about? How can we still be crying? We get on the floor and we cry. Apparently Napoleon was walking, the French dictator was walking by a synagogue on the night of Tisha B'Av, and he heard the people crying, and he asked his advisors what's going on in there. And they said, the Jewish people are crying about the destruction of their temple. And he said, oh, that's so sad. When did that happen? And they said, thousands of years ago. We've maintained the capacity and the ability to use this time to cry, to mourn what we've lost. And what we lost was a connection, was a deep belief and an understanding that God is with us all the time, that God's helping us, that God's loving us, that God is carrying us like he did in the desert, like on eagle's wings, he's carrying us. And we've lost that connection. We've lost that divine presence that's so in our hearts, in our minds, in our lives. And we've lost that. And the Beis HaMikdash, the temple, was destroyed in Jerusalem. And so we lost the capacity for God to manifest himself in the world through this, in this very intimate way with the temple. We don't have the temple. And I read something really interesting about that, which is that when the temple stood in Jerusalem, the temple represented God in the world. It was God in the world. People were bringing their sacrifices. People were flocking to the temple. There was the altars and the smoke going up and God's presence coming down. And there was a real tangible sense of God in the world, which we don't have. And that temple spread out the message throughout the world. The message was known throughout the world that there's this one God, and this is the temple, and these are the Jews, and this is the work of the Jews. And now we don't have that. We have Jews scattered all over the world. We don't have a main, temple that's our focus for our religious Jewish life. We don't have a way to understand that God is, tangibly in our world. And we've lost that, and we want that back. And that's what we're mourning. We're mourning the loss of the relationship, the disconnect that exists between us and God. And it's for us to reclaim. It's said in the oral tradition that any generation that doesn't have the third temple built, which we hope for and we yearn for, that when there isn't a third temple built, it's because our generation doesn't deserve it. We haven't done the work. Today, right now, in 2020, we're not doing the work to build that temple. So the second temple was destroyed, it says in our tradition, because of senseless, baseless, no reason hatred. We didn't love each other. We didn't take responsibility for each other. We didn't embrace each other. There was something missing in our relationships with each other. And through that baseless hatred came the downfall of the temple. And so the remedy, the rectification of the temple being destroyed because of baseless hatred is for us to exhibit, manifest, act, feel unwarranted, senseless love. Put love into the world. That's our goal. And to fix ourselves, to break open our hearts so that we can have that relationship to God. We're blocked. We're blocked by fears. We're blocked by jealousies. We're blocked by anger. We have so many negative traits that block us and block our hearts so that we don't connect as fully as we possibly could. And crying is an amazing mechanism that God gave us. It says in the midrash, in the oral tradition, that go back to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. They eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, right? They eat from this tree. God banishes them from the garden. You are now longer not able to live in the garden. Now there's going to be death in the world. But I'm giving you gifts. What are the gifts that God gives Adam and Eve? He gives them the gifts of Shabbat, which is really a gift. It's a space and time to concentrate on our relationship to God, to turn off all the noise of the world, and to focus on our spiritual lives, focus on our insides, focus on our internality, our soul, and connect to ourselves spiritually, and to connect to God, so that we have Shabbat as a gift that was given to Adam and Eve after they were expelled from the Garden of Eden. And the other gift that they were given was the capacity to cry. To the tears that Adam and Eve shed when they were expelled from the garden. I'm feeling very emotional. Was a gift that God gave Adam and Eve to cry, to access your soul, crying not flippant crying, not crying because you're peeling an onion, not crying because of something, that you hurt your foot. Okay, then maybe that's a different kind of crying. But crying that's a bedrock crying that comes from an encounter with your soul, crying that cracks you open, crying out of grief, crying out of loss, crying out of painful situations, circumstances, praying for the world. I mean, if this isn't a time to be praying for the world, God forbid that we should have any other worst calamities happening in our world. I mean, our world is going down, it seems, and coronavirus is everywhere, and racism is all over America and probably everywhere else, and it feels like we're really could be very, where are we? Why aren't we crying for the world? Where's our tears for the state of the world, for the state of humanity, for our predicament that we're in, and how do we get out of that? and if you go back to the teaching that says the way out of the destruction of the temple and it not being recreated and God not being in our midst in the same way, and the reason why that happened is because of baseless hatred. So the remedy is baseless love. We have to work on love. We have to work on loving ourselves. We have to work on loving others and giving to others and doing for others and minimizing our ego and working on these character traits that block us. And so tears are a gift, says our tradition. They're a gift that are an expression of your soul. I've heard it said that it's your soul sweating. It's something deep. It's something that washes away. It's refreshing. It's something that allows you, after a good cry, you feel like you've ridden a wave. You feel like you come through, maybe you've gone through that wave or you come out the other side. There's a catharsis that can happen from the crying, and maybe it's a lot of crying. Maybe it doesn't. It's not one good cry. Sometimes I think we do ourselves a disservice when we teach children not to cry. How many people do you see, and I see it in my work with children, where people say, "Oh, don't cry. Don't cry. Like, I don't want to see you cry." Let the child cry. There's a reason why we're crying. There's a crying because we're hurt, because we're in pain, because our heart's broken. So hug the child. Maybe in Corona we're not so easy to hug each other, but the idea is to embrace it and let it out. And it's catharsis, and let it happen, and then be on the other side of it. Be vulnerable. Live the full expression of our emotions. Don't block it so that it hold in, and then you're not feeling anything. You're not feeling the highs, and you're not feeling the lows. And I think at the end of the day, what crying gives us the gift of doing, and whether it's out of pain and mourning and loss and suffering, or it's it's tears out of joy. Like, have you not been in a wedding where you cry out of joy, or any kind of simcha, or looking at the beautiful world that we have and just crying because it's so beautiful? That's our soul. And if we cry on the different ends of that spectrum, of that emotional spectrum, we'll live a full life. When the goal, say our tradition, is to be at shalom, to be shalem. The translation of the word shalem is peace, but it's also, shalom is peace, but shalem is wholeness. And how do we achieve wholeness? Perhaps one of the ways we achieve wholeness is by allowing ourselves to experience the full gamut of our emotional lives, which includes the highs and the lows. And if we block the lows, we're not going to experience the highs. So crying is a gift. And when we look at our tradition, for instance, Rachel, our foremother, she sacrificed a lot for her sister Leah. And one of the things that she did was that she knew that Leah was married to Jacob instead of her, and she hid herself, and she gave the signs that Jacob and she had planned and plotted in case this would happen, that they would have a secret language so they would know they were married to each other, and Rachel taught that secret language to Leah. So when Leah gets switched with Rachel and she marries the forefather Jacob first, she knows the secret, so she's not embarrassed. So what Rachel did was she overcame her jealousy. She overcame the injustice of what the situation seemed like to her, and her desire to marry Jacob. She overcame all of that. Out of her extreme self-sacrifice, she didn't embarrass her sister. She gave the secrets to her sister, and her sister married Jacob instead of her. And when she then dies in childbirth, and she's crying, she's known as Rachel Imenu. She's known as our foremother foremother, Rachel, even though she only gave birth to 2 of the 12 tribes. So Leah really was the bigger of the mother. She's not known as the mother, but Rachel is known as our foremother, and her grave site is a pilgrimage site. We go there and we cry to our foremother Rachel, who cries for us. And because she was so self-sacrificing, and because she didn't give in to her jealousy and her anger, so later when the Jews are expelled from Israel and they're leaving, Rachel is crying for them, and her heartfelt, tear-filled cries to God are heard and answered, because she was able to overcome her anger and her jealousy. And his God himself, who is expelling the Jewish people, destroying the Beit HaMikdash, destroying the temple because of idolatry, because of immorality, because of baseless hatred, because the Jewish people sort of turned their backs on God, so to speak. And Rachel demonstrated the capacity to rise above that and pray and give and do for her people. And so too, God, so to speak, learns that lesson and only destroys the temple, doesn't destroy the people. And in the Holy Holies, as the temple is being destroyed, the Ark of the Covenant with the 2 angels on top that represent the relationship between Jews and God, those angels are hugging. They're hugging each other. They're not back to back. Like when you turn your back on someone, you don't want to talk to them, you don't want to know them, you turn your back on someone. When you want relationship, you turn to them and you embrace them. These 2 angels on top of the ark are embracing, signaling that there's hope. In the future, we're going to come back. In the future, we're going to reestablish that relationship with God. We're going to have an intimate relationship. There will be a 3rd temple. And this Shabbat coming up, where we're going to read this Parshat Devarim, is known as Shabbat Chazon, meaning a vision. It's the Shabbat of vision. In our pain, in our loss, right before we're going to be exiled, right before the temple is destroyed, God says we're going to hug, so to speak. We're going to have this Shabbat of Chazon. And your cries and your pain and your suffering is also mixed with hope. And a desire and a knowing that there one day there'll be clarity, one day there'll be a return. One day, says our tradition, says God, Tisha B'Av will be a rejoicing day. It will be a happy day. Instead of us mourning the loss, it will be a day. It's apparently the day, says our tradition, that the Messiah is born on Tisha B'Av. That Tisha B'Av is going to be a day of reconnection between us and the Jewish people. And what we're mourning and what we're losing, what we've lost and what we don't even recognize we've lost is that relationship with God that we had and we want again. And there's a vision for it. And we read about it in this week's Haftorah, Jeremiah. We read about the vision, the chazon, the hope that our tears, as much as they're suffering tears and they're pain tears, mixed into our tears is hope and faith, and God's with us. And maybe we can know it intellectually, but we have to know it in our hearts. And what tears do is break open the heart. Like you hear sometimes people say, open your heart in the deepest way. I don't actually know what that means. But maybe it means that when we cry, that it opens us up. It makes us vulnerable. It makes us real. And perhaps in our COVID days, that we are more real and we're more open because we're not running hither and thither. We're not distracted by many distractions of life. We're pared down to our basics. What's the point? What are we doing? And if you think about what the lesson is that we're supposed to learn in this straits, in this period between when the outer walls of Jerusalem were broken down and what's going to happen next Thursday with Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, is a day of mourning the destruction of the temple. There's a 3-week period. We're about to, as of tonight, tomorrow, we're entering a 9-day period, which is even more intense as we're getting closer and closer to the destruction of the temple. We're more and more close to this, like God's leaving us, so to speak. We've rejected God, and we've turned our back on God, and so commensurately God is turning his back on us, and measure for measure, and we yearn, and we want a vision for what's going to be, and what we have a hope for in the future, that we will be reunited, and there'll be a 3rd temple, and there'll be a Messiah, etc., etc. So this Shabbat Chazon is a light in the darkness. It's a light of hope. And Tisha B'Av is a mixture. It's tears and it's hope. It's suffering and pain and loss, and it's also hope. And the tears that we've continued to cry over the millennium is so interesting. Again, go back to our Torah and let's just very briefly revisit the story of Joseph. Joseph, who's sold by his brothers into slavery, goes down to Egypt. And what's so interesting is, if you remember, he got thrown into a pit. He gets pulled out of the pit. He gets taken to Egypt, and he rises up in Egypt. We're not going to go through the whole story. And then he becomes the viceroy. He's the one to distribute the food. There's famine in the land, and the brothers come, and he reveals himself to his brothers. And at that point, there is an enormous amount of talk about crying and weeping and weeping of joy, weeping of souls connecting, brothers coming together, etc., etc. But we learn along the way that the father Jacob never stopped crying. He never gave up on his son. And it's interesting because we do have a tradition that says at some point you have to stop mourning. If your loved one dies, we have certain prescribed time periods of intense mourning, and then they get less intense. And 10 years later, it's hoped, less than that you're still living fully, holy. You have changed and your heart has a hole in it, etc. But you're still living wholly and fully with that hole in your heart. Jacob continued to cry. And one of the reasons given why Jacob never kind of got over his grief was because on some deep level, he knew that Joseph was still alive, that you can't fully grieve he couldn't fully grieve for his son because his son was still alive. So he never really gave up. He never, deep down on a soul level and on a subconscious level, gave up on seeing his son again. So he cries for all the years that he's separated from Joseph. He cries for his son. He never gets over his grief, so to speak, or he never integrates his grief. He never gets to function properly again till he sees his son. And perhaps that's an analogous situation for us. Here we are, millennium later, still crying over the destruction of the temple because it's real and it hasn't really gone away forever. It's coming back. We're going to get that again. There's a sense that it's going to come back, and we have hope for that. So I think that's a really interesting way to think about why it is that the Jewish people continue to cry, continue to mourn, is because it's never really gone. It's still in our consciousness. It's still something we pray for and hope for, just like Jacob prayed and hoped and on some deep level knew that his son Joseph was still alive. So he was never able fully to put that down and move on, never could do that. So we too could never put that away because we're still yearning for that relationship. We're still yearning to come close and have an intimate relationship with God. So I want to go back to this idea of shalem, of being whole. And if we talk about baseless hatred as a cause for the destruction of the second temple, and we talk about how to fix that by baseless love, by being loving and being so we start at home, right? We start with ourselves. We have to love ourselves. We have to accept ourselves. And we have to work on ourselves, right? So it's not like we're a done deal. We're human and we're fallible and we make mistakes, but we're a work in progress. We are, in the words of Michelle Obama, becoming. And we shouldn't forget that we're becoming. That is the nature of our lives, is to continue to journey through life and learn and grow. And to be shalem is to be whole. And I think that when we go back to that idea of all the emotional, the whole gamut of our emotional lives should be ones that we experience, that we don't block them, that we cry when we need to, we laugh when we need to, and the laughing and the sweetness of joy will be heightened when we've really experienced the grief that's in our world. We'll do both. We'll hold both. We're able as human beings to hold the paradox of life, to hold the pain and the grief and the suffering and really truly feel that to the depths of our kishkas. And at the same time, we can rise up to the greatest joys, whatever your greatest joy is, and to really experience that. But it's soul talk. It's soul talking. It's crying out to God. It's crying out through our souls. It's not crying because you're peeling an onion. It's crying because it's accessing your soul and breaking that open. And that's, I think, the challenge of us today. Like, it's easy in this world. I mean, I think obviously there has to be boundaries, and we could very easily just be a mess all the time of what's going on in the world. So obviously it has to be a balance, but to not minimize the value that we have of feeling all those emotions. All right, so and I want to start about the Torah portion. So the Torah portion starts with Moses. He's on his deathbed, so to speak. He's his last month of his life, and he's giving over to the Jewish people the Mishnah Torah. He's recapitulating the Torah. He's saying it over again. He's he's speaking to the people, but these are not the people that were crying on the 9th of Av when the spies come back with a report that sent them into a tizzy. So that fear, anxiety, and concern that God wasn't going to be with them, that they couldn't conquer the land, that was the parents of this generation. That was 40 years ago. That generation died out. This is the next generation about to go in. And Moses is speaking to them. And he speaks to them. It says the first sentence of the Torah portion is, these are the words that Moses spoke to all of Israel. Okay, so, and he speaks to them with words of rebuke. But he doesn't rebuke them full on, like head on, did this, you did this, you did this. It's rebuke by it's a veiled rebuke. It's given by saying to the Jewish people, we were in this place, and you were in this place, and you were in this place. And the point of saying the names of the places is because in those places, these are the things that happen. In this place, you, the Jewish people, complained about the manna. And you didn't have faith that God would give you food. And in this place, you complained about water. And in this place, you built the golden calf. So it's a veiled rebuke. It's not a head-on rebuke. It's a veiled rebuke. It's a soft rebuke. It's saying, I, Moses, love you, the Jewish people. I carried you. I'm your shepherd. I have been as much as he's God's servant, he's your servant. Like he is the sort of the middleman, so to speak, between God and the Jewish people. And this Mishnah Torah, this fifth book of the Torah, is him speaking now. It's now a transition from God speaking to now Moses speaking, using the words of God, but it's him speaking. And on some level, he is saying these places in a veiled rebuke. So it's interesting if we just just take a minute to think about how can we rebuke others? Are we able to do that? Is that something that we should do? All right, so sometimes, we tell children off, but, when we speak to our peers, or we speak to our spouses, our partners, or we speak to our parents, or, parents, can we criticize them? Can we rebuke them? What are we looking for? How do we do it? And out of this week's Torah portion comes a few suggestions of, if you are going to be able or willing or want to say something to somebody, it has to come from a place of love. It cannot come from a place of anger. Really, really must come from a place of love. And there's many, many places in our Torah where we talk about loving the other, not hating the other. You should love your friend as yourself. You have to l'recha kamocha. We have so many sources for our mandate to love the other. And so any rebuke has to come from a place of love, first of all, right? Not anger. So if you're angry with your person in your life, that's not the time to say anything. So it has to come from a place of love. And who we're criticizing, who is it somebody who can hear what we have to say? So many times I might want to tell somebody off, and maybe in our COVID days, I want to tell the person to lift their mask up over their nose, or I don't know, maybe that's a little bit too trite, but it is having an opinion about what somebody else is doing. I have an opinion that you're not quarantining when you should. I think we're in a world where we're very challenged when we see other people's behavior, and it affects us. It affects me if you don't put your mask over your face and you're talking to me and you're too close and I want to back up. And, they're very real. And maybe I don't want to say something to you, or maybe you can't hear what I have to say, or I don't know. It's very, very complicated. So I don't have any answers, but I have some suggestions, right? So come from a place of love, right? This is I love you and you love me, and hopefully. And this is something that perhaps is worth talking about. So it comes from a place of love. It comes from knowing that the person can hear you. It comes with positivity, right? So in many places in this book where Moses is rebuking the people, it's also coupled with positive talk. The things the Jewish people did well, the battles that we were successful in. We're on a high, right? We're on a high. Now I can tell you something, now it can pierce through whatever barrier you might have to any kind of criticism. So it's less is more, right? You don't have to go on and on and on. Less, just like Moses, he just tells you the names of the places. He's not even saying, and because you built the golden calf. He's just saying, in this place. And then let the people infer what happened in that place. It's interesting. My husband's a doctor, so when he tells somebody bad news, So, like, let's say they come in and he has a test result and it says the person has cancer. So you don't tell the person right off, and this is the ethics of disclosing information, you don't tell the person right off. You say, got this result and we're not sure about this and that, and you sort of lead the person for them to come up with the diagnosis themselves, and then they'll sort of say, oh, you saying that I have cancer, like it comes from them. Again, I've seen this. This might be a bit of a tangent, but I've seen this when you want to have to tell somebody bad news, somebody died. So you don't say right off somebody died. You would say, somebody was maybe, I don't know, there was somebody recently in California, a very sad story of a young boy who drowned. And I would say, well, he was out in a lake and he was swimming, and his family tried to save him. And then, like, you lead the person slowly for them to make the conclusion themselves. It's a much more kind of a gentle way, perhaps, of delivering such terrible, sad, heartbreaking news, but to come at it slowly and not head on, and less. Like, you don't have to say a lot, just like stop. And then the timing, when it is that you say your rebuke. And that it has to be hard for you to give that rebuke. Like, I don't want to say this to you, however, I think it's important, right? So it's not something you're eager to tell somebody. So it comes from a place where it's hard to say. So it also says in our tradition that a wise person is able to hear criticism, is wants the rebuke, which is also very interesting. So from the person giving the rebuke, there's certain ways to do that out of love, certain timing, not head on, less is more, coming from a place where it's hard to do, etc. With the timing, with extra blessings, with extra positivity, mixed in from the person giving the rebuke. And then the person who's receiving the rebuke, says our tradition, a person able to is a wise person. It's a wise person, because if you're able to listen to it, what you're really saying is, I want to be better. I'm not so wedded to my position. I'm not so entrenched in who I am that I can't change and I can't move, right? And I'm human, and I'm not fallible. I'm infallible. I am fallible. I'm not infallible. And for you to give me that feedback in a positive way is great, because it helps me be better. And that's what it is. We're all becoming. And I think perhaps this Torah portion and this time period is about us becoming. How do we rectify what happened when the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, or the spies came back and the people believed the stories? They didn't have faith in God and they didn't know God was with them. How do we get back to a place where we understand God's with us? And how do we get to a place where we're willing to grow and we're willing to move? Moses Rabbeinu, our teacher, Moses, at the beginning, when he's at the burning bush and God says, I want you to be my mouthpiece and I want you to go talk to Pharaoh, Moses says, I can't do it. I'm not a man of words. I have a stutter, or I'm hard of speech. I don't speak properly. I can't do this job. I'm the wrong man for the job. And what does God say? I'm going to help you. I'm going to be with you. You have to go, and I'll give you Aaron. But here's Moses, who has a stutter, who is hard to speak, and here we are at the end, and he's speaking. The whole rest of the book of Deuteronomy is Moses speaking. What happened? He transformed. He became transformed. He went from a man who couldn't speak to a man that can speak. And it was his work, and it was God helping him, and it was him doing his mission in the world. But he became a man who was able to speak. So too, we should have faith in ourselves. We should believe in ourselves. We can do things. We can do a lot more than we're doing. We can change ourselves more. I'm not stuck. I know people say, the older you get, the more stuck in your ways you become. I think we have to break that. I think that we are able to move ourselves and grow and change and redefine who we are and redefine our derech and kind of like work on ourselves and change. We have to. Otherwise we're stuck. And then we're not really growing, and we're not human, and we're not becoming better and more. And that's what we're here for, to become better and more. All right. So Moshe Rabbeinu is a man who transforms himself with God's help. He's able to become this leader who's able to speak and talk and say to the people, here's what we need to do. And he rebukes them from love. He's on his deathbed. What better timing is that? He's about to die, so you can't really argue with him. You can listen to him, and he's shown his love for the Jewish people all the way along. So That's Moses, and one lesson that we learn from Moses is how to see a person who changes. And Moses also is this old person. Like, who are old people in our generation? And again, with COVID, perhaps we're not so, what's the word? We're not so, we don't honor the old people perhaps as we should or we could. And old people, so the old people are dying of COVID. Doesn't matter, they're going to die anyway. No, says our Torah. Like, Moses was 120 years old. That's where we get you should live to 120 years old from Moses, who lives to 120 years old. But Moses is sharp and physically fit till the end, till the very end. So he's a man who is able to carry the generation. He's a man, I read somewhere, maybe this word, I think it's Rabbi Sachs, who talks about Moses as the keeper of meaning, right? He's teaching the people meaning, Torah, how to connect to God, how to live your life, how to go into the land. And we're not going to talk, he doesn't talk about the sacrifices, he doesn't talk about the temple service. He talks about how to create judges and laws and how to look after each other and how to have a judicial system and how to be compassionate for each other and how to be a good friend and how to be a good neighbor and how to be a good person in the world. That's the keeper of meaning. The meaning of your life is to move and grow and be better and become. And Moses is the keeper of that meaning, and he's teaching it to his descendants, all of his descendants. It says all the Jewish people are there. That first sentence I just read you, these are the words that Moses spoke to all of Israel. We're all there, not just the generation on the edge. It says that all the people who died were there, all the souls were there, and all the generations to come are there. We're all there listening to Moses, every single person. And we're renewing that covenant that we made at Mount Sinai when we said, we'll do it, and then we'll learn about it. We're renewing that covenant. We're understanding that we want that covenant. We want to be, so to speak, the nation that's married to God, and we want God to help us when we go into the land. And Moses is the one to speak his, so to speak, last will and testament to the people, to his people, to the people, to all of us who are united. Are we united? We're one people, we're one soul, we're one destiny, we have one land. There's so much that we are united, focused on, and yet we're so disconnected. Again, another thing to work on in our day is to unite the Jewish people. We're so disconnected. How to unite us, which is again something that we were then at that point as we're about to enter the land. We were united people around the land, the Torah, the peoplehood, the soulhood. We were united, and let's try to get that again. So he is the keeper of meaning, and he's also the one who cares for the next generation. He's not sort of sitting there, gloating on his life well lived. He's still teaching. That's why he's Moshe Rabbeinu. He's Moses, our teacher. Yes, he's our liberator. Yes, he's our shepherd. But we don't use that term. When we talk about him, we talk about him as Moshe Rabbeinu. He's our teacher, right? Who's our teacher? Who teaches us? How do we learn? How do we know how to live our lives? How do we know how to be better? We go into the Torah and we read the commentators and we listen to Torah classes and we keep moving. We keep moving. So one of the things I think certainly I'm doing, and I suggest it's a good thing to do, is to work on Musa. So Musa is a body of teaching on character, on working on your character traits, working on humility and patience and generosity and so on and so on, and not being angry, and all these character traits that are who we are. And the work of Musa is to focus on those and to think about them and try to change them. And there's a whole curriculum of how to do that. But even to break up into little groups and start Musa groups at this time, like we don't have the distractions of life that take us away. We have what to do, and the purpose of our lives is to grow and become. So let's grow and become. How do we do that? I don't know. Through Musa, through Torah learning, through loving each other, through working on ourselves and becoming better, through doing good, through loving others, through doing for others, etc. So, we have a lot to do, even though we can't go anywhere. We have a lot to do just in our own homes and our own Zooms. All right. So let's just recap a little bit. So these are the words that Moses spoke to all of Israel. So just in that one sentence, we've got words that Moses speaks. the Moses who transformed himself, who became somebody who could speak, who became old and vibrant, and the keeper of the tradition, of meaning, of caring for the next generation, still working, still moving, still giving, still teaching, right? Still learning. Moses, right? Moses transforms himself. We can transform ourselves. Moses who rebukes the people, and he rebukes the people in a veiled way, and he does it with the right timing, and he does it out of love, and he does it less rather than more, etc., etc. Those are lessons of how to rebuke, and to be a person who can hear rebuke. That if we can, like, not get too vested in who we are and let ourselves be open to change and listening to obviously the right people telling us. Right, people who are going to tell us with love and help us grow and help us, work on ourselves and reflect on who we are and how we act, etc. Get the right people to help us with that, and then to understand that this is a period as we're entering into Tisha B'Av, that we read this parsha, we read Devarim, which has the episode of the spies, which has the people crying because they gave up faith that God was going to help them go into the land. And that's a night of crying for many millenniums, still is a night of crying till today. And through these destructions that have gone on throughout the millennium, we're still crying. We're still mourning the loss of the temple. We're mourning the loss of the relationship of the Shekhinah, of that divine presence, and somehow break that open, to use the tears to break it open. I want to talk a little bit more about tears. That, as I mentioned, there's a teaching that the first tears were given as a gift to Adam and Eve when they were expelled from the Garden of Eden. But there's also an idea that tears when we cry out with tears to God, that prayer will be answered, that the gates of heaven, so to speak, metaphorical, the gates of heaven are open when we cry tears to God. It has to be Lifnei Hashem, it has to be that we include God, that we're crying out from the depths of our souls, that our cries are to God to help us, that we acknowledge God, that there's a God in the world, and that there's also hope. The tears are tears of suffering and pain, etc., but they're also tears mixed with hope, that there's a chazon, that this Shabbat, a chazon, that there will be a redemption in the future, there will be a future that looks better than this, that Tisha B'Av that we have today is a sad day, but in the future it's going to be a happy day, that in the Beit HaMikdash, in the temple, in the Holy of Holies, that the angels that were representative of our relationship to God were embracing each other, signaling that we're going to come together again. And there's also a teaching that Rabbi Akiva had a prophecy that there would be foxes on the Temple Mount, and there were foxes on the temple. He saw foxes on the Temple Mount, and as the temple's being destroyed, and there are foxes on the Temple Mount, he's laughing, and his tears are mixed with happiness, because he sees the beginning of the redemption. That yes, we're in a bad place, and it doesn't look good, but not all hope is lost. There's going to be a future, and there's going to be a regrowth. So it's interesting if you think. We have in our life, in our world, the idea of a seed. You take a seed, the reality of a seed. You take a seed, and it's a sunflower seed, and you stick it in the earth, and you water it, and the seed disintegrates. The seed disappears. It gets destroyed. But yet, if you keep watering it, up will come a sunflower, hopefully, or a tree, or whatever you plant, right? So you plant something, and it grows. And that reality that we see in our world is a parable for the world, right? We see the destruction of the temple. It's destroyed, but we know there's going to be a third temple. We know there's going to be a third temple. There's hope in the future. We know through our tradition teaches us that we die, our body goes into the ground, our soul goes up into the higher realms, but our body goes into the ground like a seed into the ground. It disintegrates, it becomes one with the dust of the earth, but that yet in the future, there's going to be a clarity, there's going to be a reconnection. The seeds is going to come back up together. The soul and body will be reconstituted, and we will have the resurrection. So we have this reality in our world of the seed in the ground growing into a tree to tell us that can happen. If it can happen in front of your very eyes, then why give up on that? Don't give up on that. It's going to happen with the temple, and our relationship to God's going to be reestablished, and it's going to happen with death and the end of death, and the tears are going to be wiped away, because tears aren't going to be needed anymore. Tears break open our hearts. Tears help us access ourselves so we can access God, so we can come back to God, so we can have a relationship with the divine. That's what tears are going to help us do. They're going to help us cleanse and heal and wash away the emotion, and like, it's like a cleansing bath of emotion, that it comes out, and then we're open and we're wide, and we can have the relationship with ourselves, with others, with God. We can have those relationships when we allow ourselves to cry, when we allow that to happen. And it also says in the Kabbalistic teachings, and I'm going to read this because it's so lovely, when the time comes for you to finally leave this world and ascend to the heavenly throne, you will be shown how precious your tears were. You'll be told that God himself gathered every teardrop and treasured them like precious gems. And you will be shown that whenever there was a harsh decree hovering over the Jewish people, God took one of your tears and washed the evil decree away. Isn't that amazing? And Rav Pinchas says that there are times in our personal lives, unbeknownst to us, when we are in serious trouble and we are in desperate need of prayers, but because we are completely unaware of the danger we are in, we consequently do not even think to pray. It is in those times when God will take out the tear from our own treasury of prayers and use them for the times that we need them most. I think that's so lovely. So God's taking our tears, and they're never lost. They go into a container, and they're there, and they are used. And they might not be used in our lifetime, and they might not be used on us, but they're used, and they're real, and they have access to God, who is the captain of the ship. Another idea is that when the temple is destroyed, when there's pain and suffering in the world, that God also cries, that God is crying also, which is rough. Like when you tell your children off, you cry, right? It's hard. You're like, you don't like to see your children sad, but there's a reason why you have to tell them off, or they have to help them, or whatever. So they're crying, you're crying, you are crying. Maybe you're not physically crying, but there's a sense of pain that you feel if you tell your children off. You love them so much, and you don't want them to see, you don't want them to be chastised. They might need it, right? They cry, you cry, God cries. When we got exiled from the temple, when the temple was destroyed, God crying. And there's a medrash that says that there was an angel called Metrodon who didn't want to see God crying. And he says, God, don't cry, I'll cry for you. And God says, I have to do this. And he goes into a private place, so to speak. It's all, don't know what this means, but he goes into a private place, goes into the Nistarim, goes into a chamber, a hidden chamber, and he cries. That God's also crying. So the power of crying, the power of tears, the people in our history who have cried, Rachel, our foremother, who cries, and Moses who cries, and Jacob who's crying, and Joseph, with so much crying. And it's real. So why are we so frightened of it? Why are we so unable to allow crying in our society? Go to a shiva house, and you're not there to cheer people up, right? You're there to sit with them. You're there to be with them in their presence. Yeah, cheer them up is the wrong word. Like you want them to decide how to use their time in shiva. If they want to cry, you're there. You're holding them, right? You're in the pit with them. And your presence is comforting. You don't have to say anything. You're unable to fix it, that's for sure. But you're there to say, I'm with you, and I hold you, and I hear you, and I'm there, and it doesn't have to be words, and it's not about fixing it. It's about allowing the person the space to cry, and giving permission to cry. We have to give ourselves permission to cry, and we have to give others the permission to cry. So one of the things that the spies are faulted for when they come back is what they saw with their eyes when they went into the land, and what they came back and spoke about, and how what we see and how what we say are related. So we could see what we want to see, or we could see what really is there. So almost like, what comes first? Do we see and then evaluate it and then speak it? Or do we have in our mind what we want to see, and then we see what we want to see, and then we speak what we want to see? So it's sort of a little bit like we've hijacked the sense of seeing, because seeing isn't objective. It's become a tool for us to speak what we want, because we've chosen to see what we want to see. And what the spies were faulted for was seeing what they wanted to see and then speaking a report because they were frightened. And so in our lives, sometimes that's also hard, how to see things with clarity, how to have clarity in our world when we are so subjective. And perhaps that gets back to the whole notion of rebuke, and it gets back to the whole notion of having people in our camp, in our inner circle, who can help us, because they are able to see with different eyes. And they do have our best interest in mind, hopefully, right? You've got to have somebody who has your best interest in mind. So when they give you feedback, it helps you see. Like sometimes I say to my husband, like, give me a reality check here, because I'm seeing this and I'm feeling all emotional, and this is how I see things, and like, could you give me a reality check? Like, you're a little bit calmer, you're a little bit outside of like my passion around this particular emotion, and I need you to tell me how to see this perhaps more clearly. And so that could be another lesson we could draw from this week's Torah portion in vis-a-vis what the spies did, was allow their emotions to take over, such that the seeing was hijacked by by their fears. And again, it's the fear. What's it the fear of? What are we frightened of? And in that case, it was fear of going in, fear that God wasn't with us. God isn't with us, and that we go into the land, we're going to be decimated because God isn't there with us. How could they even think that? Like, they got taken onto this emotional roller coaster, and they turned their backs on God. And perhaps it's also our challenge is to not see God in our lives, and to say, like, I can't do that, or I don't have enough self-confidence, or I don't believe in myself, or I don't believe God will help me, or whatever it is that we do in our day and age that is very similar to the language of the spies, and the capacity that humanity has, that we have as a human being, to allow our thoughts to take over what we say versus like maybe what we see. And we talked last week about how thinking is so important, and what we think and what we say is so important, and it really, really, really is. So these are the Devarim, these are the words that Moses is saying. Our words are so, so important. Are they linked to what we're actually seeing? Is it linked to clarity? We want clarity, and that could be another thing that we're absolutely yearning for in this generation now. Clarity. What's going to happen? How are we going to get through this? When are we going to get through this? What's the other side of COVID going to look like? No clarity. We don't have clarity. Listen to all these voices coming at us from different places, and it's just so confusing. And it's like, I don't know, and it's almost like I have to look up and cry out and shed real tears and say, help. We need help here. This is not good. And maybe it's a similar kind of a situation. I'm speaking as a religious person, that we need to take this time and cry real tears to God and say, do something, help us. We need help. We can't do this on our own. We really, mamash, cannot do this on our own. So, and we want to build the next Beit HaMikdash, and we want to bring the Messiah, and we want this all to end, and we want unity amongst the Jewish people, and we want to grow, and we want to love, and we want to bring God into the equation. We can do that, and we've got to work on it now, and we've got to keep working on it, and we've got to grow, and we've got to, in the words of Michelle Obama, become our best selves. And we can do that. And we have every morning we wake up, God's giving us life again, and He has faith that we can do this. This is a time of faith. Another thing I learned about tears is that they come from our eyes, obviously, and they come out of our tear duct. We have a tear duct. And there's a morning prayer we say every morning. Actually, there's a prayer we say every time we go to the bathroom, where we thank God for the orifices and the cavities that we have that are open. The ones that are open, and the ones that are closed, but that our bodies function well, that our capacity to go to the bathroom, please God, should be always working correctly and healthily. And the prayer is reference to all our orifices, all of our holes, so to speak. And I heard it given over that we want our capacity to cry to remain open. We don't want to block our capacity to cry. So as much as we don't want to block our intestinal functioning, we also don't want to somehow help us not block our tear ducts. I thought that's great. So like when you come out of the bathroom and that blessing is said, perhaps we can have another intention with that blessing, that it's also a blessing to allow us to cry, because crying is cathartic, crying is healthy, crying is important, and it's a gift. And if we can cry, and then we have the capacity to hold even more. The more that we have the courage to hold more, because we're more open and more expansive. Okay, so as I said, the tears that we shed in true prayer are never unanswered. That God holds our prayers, our tears up in the heavens. That the gates of heaven are open when we cry out to God. And when we read the Book of Lamentations next week, Echa, the term is Echa. Like how could this happen? Where are we going? Goes back to back to Adam and Eve. When they ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, God says to them, Ayeka, where are you? Where are you? Where are we? And it's a time of taking stock. And it's a time of knowing, where am I? Where am I going? What do I want? How am I spending my time? Like all of a sudden I have a lot more time. And how am I going to spend that time? And it's a challenge. And we can rise to that challenge, and we can pivot and make this a very productive time, I think. I think there's a lot to learn. All right, so didn't get very far into the Torah portion, but my hour is up. But I pray and I hope that we find the capacity to open up our hearts, that we find that we are helped to become shalem, that we're able to experience the full gamut of who we are as people, that we can cry, and we can cry out of sadness, and we can cry out of joy, and that there are two sides of the coin, and that the seeds that we plant, whether they're metaphorical or physical seeds that we plant, will grow and sprout and become healthy and beautiful trees that will grow from the destruction. That the destruction is just a piece along the way, and that there's a regrowth and a resprouting and a resurrection and a redemption that is our hope. We're a people of hope. Our prayer is hatikva, right? It's a prayer of hope, that we have a vision for a better future, and we have to keep hold of that vision. Otherwise, it's all despair. And know that God's with us, just like God was with us all the way along. God's still with us and still crying along with us. And so the intermingling of the tears and the unity of the Jewish people, and the unity that we can achieve of soul and community and unity, and will bring about that regrowth. And I wish you all a really good Chodesh. It's the month of Av, began tonight. It's the new month of Av, which interestingly, the zodiac sign for Av is the lion, is the Aryeh. And Aryeh is known for passion, for heat, for, vim and vigor and action, and to be passionate. So superimposed onto all of those lessons that we just spoke about is this capacity that we have to live with heat and passion and direct that in the correct way. So that's the bracha, that we should channel our heat and our energy into a better world.